Helmuth von Pannwitz was a German military officer whose life reflected the turbulence and moral complexity of Europe in the first half of the 20th century. He was born in 1898 into a Prussian aristocratic family, a background that strongly shaped his values and career path. Like many young men of his class, he was raised with a sense of duty to the state, respect for military tradition, and loyalty to hierarchical authority. These influences guided him toward a life in uniform at a very early age. Pannwitz grew up during the final decades of the German Empire, a society that placed high prestige on the army. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he was still a teenager, but he soon joined the German army. The war exposed him to modern industrial warfare, which was brutal, chaotic, and far removed from the romantic image of soldiering that many young officers had imagined. He served primarily in cavalry-related roles, even as cavalry itself was becoming less important on battlefields, dominated by machine guns and artillery. Germany's defeat in 1918 and the collapse of the empire left a deep mark on him, as it did on many officers who felt their world had been taken away. After the war, Germany was forced to drastically reduce its armed forces under the Treaty of Versailles. Pannwitz remained in military service during this period, joining the small Reichswehr that replaced the Imperial Army. Advancement was slow and competitive, but he steadily built a reputation as a disciplined and capable officer. During the interwar years, the German military emphasized professionalism, training, and loyalty to the state rather than to any political ideology. Pannwitz fit well into this environment, focusing on tactics, leadership, and maintaining order during a time of political instability and economic hardship. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and began rearming Germany, the military expanded rapidly. This created new opportunities for officers like Pannwitz. He continued to serve in cavalry units, which the German army was adapting into more mobile formations such as reconnaissance and mounted infantry. By the time the Second World War began in 1939, Pannwitz was an experienced officer in his early 40s, older than many frontline commanders, but valued for his organizational skills and calm demeanor. During the early stages of the Second World War, Germany achieved rapid victories in Poland and Western Europe. Pannwitz took part in these campaigns, in various staff and command roles. As the war progressed, however, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 opened a new and far more brutal chapter. The Eastern Front became a place of extreme violence, ideological warfare, and widespread suffering among both soldiers and civilians. It was in this environment that Pannwitz's career took its most distinctive and controversial turn. One of the challenges facing the German army in the Soviet Union was the vast size of the territory and the diversity of local populations. German leaders sought to exploit ethnic, political, and historical divisions within the Soviet Union by recruiting auxiliary forces from among non-Russian groups and anti-Soviet elements. Among these were Cossacks, communities with a long tradition of cavalry service and a complicated relationship with Russian and Soviet authorities. Many Cossacks had suffered repression under Soviet rule and saw cooperation with Germany as a way to fight their old enemy or regain autonomy. Pannwitz became closely associated with the organization and command of Cossack units in German service. He was appointed to lead formations made up largely of Cossack volunteers and former Soviet prisoners of war. Over time, these units were expanded and reorganized, eventually forming the 15 Cossack Cavalry Corps, which was placed under the Waffen-SS, although many of its members were not German and did not share Nazi ideology in any deep sense. Pannwitz himself was not originally an SS officer, but he accepted the transfer, seeing it as a means to protect his command and maintain its effectiveness. Under Pannwitz's leadership, the Cossack units were used primarily in anti-partisan operations in occupied territories, especially in parts of Yugoslavia and the Balkans. These operations were harsh and often involved reprisals against civilians, destruction of villages, and severe violence. While Pannwitz was known among his troops for sharing their hardships and showing personal courage, his command was part of a broader system of occupation that caused immense suffering. The line between combat against armed resistance and punishment of civilian populations was frequently crossed, and the Cossack units, like many others on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans, were implicated in serious abuses. As the war turned against Germany after 1943, Pannwitz's corps was increasingly used to hold ground and suppress resistance, rather than conduct mobile operations. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly, with Allied forces advancing from the west and the Red Army pushing relentlessly from the east. Many of the Cossacks under Pannwitz feared what would happen if they fell into Soviet hands, knowing that they would be seen as traitors. This fear strongly influenced their decisions in the final phase of the war. In 1945, as Germany collapsed, Pannwitz led his forces toward Austria, hoping to surrender to British troops rather than the Soviets. He believed that surrendering to Western allies might spare his men from execution or imprisonment. When they reached British-controlled territory, the Cossacks laid down their arms. Pannwitz himself could have attempted to avoid responsibility by separating from his troops, but he chose to remain with them, insisting that he shared their fate. This decision later became one of the most discussed aspects of his life. Despite initial hopes, the political agreements between the Allies required that Soviet citizens who had fought for Germany be returned to the Soviet Union. This policy led to the forced repatriation of tens of thousands of Cossacks and other Soviet nationals. Pannwitz, although a German citizen, voluntarily accompanied his men when they were handed over to Soviet authorities. He was arrested by the Soviet security services and taken to Moscow. Pannwitz spent the next 2 years in Soviet captivity. During this time, he was interrogated and investigated for his role in the war. The Soviet authorities viewed him as a major collaborator and enemy commander responsible for crimes against Soviet citizens. In 1947, he was tried by a Soviet military tribunal. The trial focused on his leadership of Cossack forces and their actions during the war. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Later that year, he was executed. Helmuth von Pannwitz remains a controversial figure in history. Supporters have portrayed him as a professional soldier who showed loyalty to his men and acted according to a traditional sense of honor. They point to his decision to share the fate of his troops as evidence of personal integrity. Critics, on the other hand, emphasize his role in commanding forces that participated in brutal occupation policies and anti-partisan warfare. From this perspective, his personal courage does not outweigh the harm caused under his authority. His life illustrates the difficult moral questions faced by individuals in times of total war. Pannwitz was shaped by a military culture that valued obedience, hierarchy, and duty, sometimes above ethical reflection. He operated within a system that rewarded effectiveness and loyalty while normalizing extreme violence. Understanding his story does not mean excusing his actions, but it helps explain how ordinary professional soldiers became involved in extraordinary crimes during the Second World War.